Hey everyone, welcome to some at-home notes on evolution. So this topic here is evolution of populations. So first, I want you to think back to our definition of a population. So see if you want to just pause the video and then think back, maybe look back in your notes and think back, what is the definition of a population? See if you can write that down and then start the video again to look at the definition. Okay, so hopefully you came up with the same kind of idea that a population is a group of the same species. So remember, we got to be the same species here, living and interbreeding in the same area at the same time. So I got a little picture here off to the right. We've got some birds and squirrels and fish. So I want you to consider each group of organisms, okay? And I want you to tell me which are populations and which are not as far as the comparison here, birds A and B, fish A and B, squirrels A and B. Which ones under our definition would be considered populations? All right, pause the video, give that some thought, put down your answer, and then start the video. Okay, so if you thought the first two, birds A and B, so we've got birds A and B here and here, or a population, you're correct. And fishes A and B, also population, but squirrels A and B not, right? And the reason being is that birds A and B and fish A and B have the ability to live and interbreed within the same area. So unless this squirrel is in the same realm as Michael Phelps and can navigate those waters to interbreed with squirrel B on the island, they're not considered the same population. So even if they have the ability to interbreed, but they're geographically isolated, then they're not part of the same population. And so what we're focusing on here is evolution of populations, okay? So this is how a population may evolve over time, okay? So we begin with what's called microevolution of populations, all right? And so when we think about that term micro, all right, what we're going to see here is there are both microevolution and macroevolution. And so microevolution is literally that. It's evolution on a small scale, and macroevolution is evolution on a larger scale. And we'll see the difference between them as we go. So to start with, microevolution. So recall that Darwin, in Darwin's theory of evolution and his idea of evolution by natural selection, the most important thing in there is that there exists variation, right? And so whether we're talking about, these birds, these fish, these squirrels, as much as they might look exactly the same to us, there's variation, just like there's variation if we look at us, in a classroom, tall, short, dark hair, no hair, blonde hair, blue eyes, dark skin, light skin. There's variation among a population, right? Variation among individuals in a population. So first off, we want to look at, well, how does this variation occur, right? Where does variation come from? Why is one person's skin darker, right? Why is that squirrel's tail a little fluffier? So variation occurs through mutations in our DNA, right? But it also occurs from sexual reproduction. Okay, these are two very important ways in which variation occurs. If you are part of a population that reproduces sexually, just that process, having two separate parents, will create offspring with variation. So you've got two of these things contributing. One is mutations occur in our DNA, and those mutations occur naturally. Well, they can also occur unnaturally, but mutations happen within the DNA of an organism. It's unpreventable, and it's just a quality of life. And secondly, sexual reproduction creates variations. All the different versions of genes within individuals of a population is referred to as the gene pool, right? You've probably heard that term before, right? So when we talk about, whether it's a group of people living in Vernon, whether it's a group of squirrels living on an island, no matter what the population is, when you account for all the different versions of genes within individuals of a population is referred to as the gene pool. Okay? Note, okay, this is an important term that's going to come up later on. Different versions of a gene are called alleles. Okay? And we'll get to this a little bit later on. But what it means essentially is, for example, we've talked about this before, where we all have a gene that will determine the outcome of the color of our hair. Now, there could be different versions of that gene that lead to blonde hair, that lead to red hair, that lead to black hair, and so on. So we call these different versions of a gene alleles, all right? And those contribute to the gene pool. Now, natural selection, all right? Natural selection is what Darwin coined as the process that acts on the gene pool. Natural selection acts on the gene pool, selecting for specific changes that increase survival and reproduction. Right? So variation occurs through mutations and sexual reproduction. And maybe it makes one squirrel's tail really fluffy and another squirrel's tail less fluffy. And natural selection will act on selecting for the specific variation that increases survival and reproduction within the population, thus leading to increased allele frequency. Okay, so for example, we've got this bushy-tailed squirrel and this squirrel with maybe somewhat of a less bushy tail. Maybe natural selection is such that for a predator, grabbing hold of this bushy tail, this really bushy tail, is advantageous for that predator, not so advantageous for the squirrel with the bushy tail. So natural selection, the selecting agent here being the predator, which will select for the bushy tails, leaving the less bushy tail to survive, reproduce, and now the allele that leads to that less bushy tail will increase in frequency in the population. So we'll see more squirrels with a slightly less bushy tail than we would see squirrels with a bushier tail. Okay? Jot down your questions. If you want to pause this video at any time and just sort of jot down your questions that you can bring to class. Super important, right? Now, these small changes within the gene pool of a population over generations represents microevolution, okay? We're not talking about creating entirely different organisms, right? This squirrel is still a squirrel. It's just got subtle differences. And it might be a bushier tail, it might be a lighter brown color, or maybe even more towards a gray-brown color, or maybe it's got slightly larger teeth. These are all just little variations. But we say that evolution is occurring because there is a change in the heritable traits and characteristics of the population. Remember way back when we defined, maybe I still have that up here. Do I still have, maybe on, right? Evolution, any change in the heritable traits, right, of a population, oops, not highlighted, of a population over generations, right? So this is microevolution. Taken over generations, microevolution, right? Microevolution over many generations can lead to the gradual specialization of a species to the local environment. Okay, think owl butterfly. I just love this picture. I mean, look at this thing. It's unbelievable, right? This is just a butterfly, right? But obviously looks exactly like an owl. This didn't happen overnight, right? And if you want to see a very cool video, I don't know if I have it. Let me pause the video for 1 sec here. Okay, yeah, I found it. So it wasn't actually in our Moodle, but I put it in there. So if you go to the Moodle and go to our book of videos, and if you scroll down to number 7, Evolution of Owl Butterfly, check this out. It's really worth watching to kind of understand how the process of microevolution can lead to something so sophisticated as this camouflaged owl butterfly, right? Because that's really all it is. Over generations and generations leads to the specialization of this species to its local environment, right? Um, so let's recall natural selection is the process by which organisms, sorry for the background noise, that's my daughter upstairs. The process by which organisms better adapted to their environment, survive and pass those traits on, Okay? Now that's what Darwin uncovered, right? And this process, Darwin didn't know about, the genetics and DNA and alleles. He just knew, right? Most fundamental thing is that variation exists, all right? And nature will select. And this is the real confusing thing for students to get across, right? They want to think that an organism will just adapt to its environment because it needs to. No. A population has variation among all its individuals, and nature will decide for what adaptations are successful and those that aren't. And those that aren't are negatively selected for, right? Like it's in a negative way. It's like, ooh, this did not benefit the squirrel, right? Big bushy tail, no problem. Those birds, owls, whatever predator is hunting down those squirrels and is able to grab hold of that big bushy tail will just say, no, this is not a favorable adaptation for you. See you later. And they get eaten and they are less likely to survive and pass that trait on. So natural selection, the process by which organisms better adapted to their environment. And this better adaptation doesn't come from the organism specifically deciding, it simply comes from the fact that there is variation that occurs. And that variation is out of our control, right? Sure, I wouldn't mind being 6'5" and massive head of hair and built like a truck, but I got the genes that I got, right? So whatever those genes are, that's what you've got, and nature selects for those best suited to the environment. Okay, so what are some forces? What are these factors that can influence? So let's look at this. From above, we can say that if allele frequencies change within populations from generation to generation, then evolution is occurring. So remember what we were saying here is that there is variation that's caused by mutations in DNA or sexual reproduction, and it leads to different versions of alleles. And if, right, the certain alleles survive over others, then there's an increase in allele frequency and a change. And thus we can say evolution has occurred, right? In this case, we say specifically microevolution has occurred. Changes in the allele frequency of a population is microevolution. So what are the natural forces that drive changes in allele frequency? Okay, so for this part, this last bit. So what are the natural forces that drive changes in allele frequency? What I'm going to get you guys to do, you'll be able to stop the video and do this yourself. There are 4. They are described very well in your book. And in fact, I'm just going to go to your book here now. So this is your online book. So go to chapter 9, Theory of Evolution. And if you scroll down, you're going to go to this section right here, Microevolution and the Genetics of Populations. So I really want you to read this whole little section. So here's the thing though, you're going to go through reading all this. We've already talked about this, scale of evolution, micro versus macro, genes in populations, gene pool. So I want you to read through this up until here. Do not read the Hardy-Weinberg theorem. This is, gets into the complexity. Even this part up here is not that critical, but read up to the beginning of the Hardy-Weinberg theorem and then stop and then just scroll all the way down until you get to forces of evolution. So just like we talked, there are 4 such forces: mutation, gene flow, genetic drift, and natural selection. So I want you to read each paragraph and just put in a very short couple of sentences your definition. Mutation right here, gene flow, genetic drift, and then of course genetic drift has 2, bottleneck and founder effect, and then down at the bottom we have natural selection. Okay, so if you look at your notes, we got a place for the first one, which is mutation. And so you describe in your words beside a definition. Then we have gene flow, all right? And then we have what is called genetic drift, all right? And that can occur either by a bottleneck or the founder effect, all right? And I've kind of given some visuals here over on the side, and we're going to discuss this in class, all right? But then the last one being natural selection. So I want you to read those paragraphs, put in your definition, and I believe that is where we're going to stop for now. All right, so we'll take things up on Monday. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and hope everything else is going well.